He thought a locked door was a boundary. He didn't realize it was a grave. Arthur married her for duty, gave her a title, and then walked past her bedchamber every single night for 3 years. He mistook her quiet acceptance for obedience. He mistook his own cowardice for discipline. But a woman's devotion doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes. And by the time Arthur reached for her, he found nothing but an empty room and the lingering scent of bitter tea. The corset strings bit into Amelia's ribs, a sharp physical reminder of the bargain she had struck. She stood in the center of the cavernous master suite of Westford Manor, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and old dust. The fire in the hearth was large but strangely ineffective, its heat swallowed by the sheer expanse of the room. A young maid fumbled with the intricate hooks of Amelia's heavy silk gown. The fabric rustled, a dry, papery sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Shall I brush out your hair, Your Grace?" Mary's voice was a nervous whisper, her eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards. "Just unpin it," Amelia replied, her own voice sounding foreign in her ears. Flat resigned, she caught her reflection in the towering gilded mirror. She looked pale, her skin sallow against the stark white of her shift. She did not look like a blushing bride. She looked like a ledger entry. The Pendleton family had paid her father's crippling debts. In exchange, she was to provide Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Westford, with an heir and a respectable domestic facade. It was a transaction. She had known this. Yet beneath the pragmatism, a stubborn, pathetic ember of hope still burned in her chest. Arthur was not an ugly man. He was rigid, yes, his posture so straight it looked as though it caused him physical pain. But there had been a moment during the ceremony when his hand brushed hers. His skin had been warm. For a fraction of a second, his fingers had lingered. Mary finished her tasks and practically fled the room, leaving Amelia alone with the ticking of the mahogany grandfather clock in the hall. 10. Amelia sat on the edge of the massive Forrester bed. The mattress was overstuffed with down yielding and formless. She gripped the edge of the heavy velvet quilt, the coarse fibers digging into her fingertips. She waited. The manor was silent, save for the wind rattling the loose leaded glass of the windows. Then she heard them. Footsteps. Arthur's boots on the hardwood runner of the corridor. Click-clack. Measured, precise, unhurried. The sound moved closer, vibrating slightly through the floorboards beneath her bare feet. She held her breath. Her stomach tightened, a knot of anxiety and anticipation wrapping around her lungs. She smoothed the front of her nightgown, suddenly acutely aware of how thin the cotton was, how the draft raised goosebumps on her arms. The footsteps stopped outside her door. Amelia stared at the heavy oak panels. She could see the faint shadow of his boots in the sliver of light beneath the door frame. She imagined him standing there, his hand resting on the brass knob. She waited for the metallic click of the latch turning. She waited for the door to swing open, for the heavy scent of starched linen and cold ash that always clung to him to enter the room. The silence stretched. It was not a comfortable silence. It was taut, suffocating, then a subtle shift in the shadows. The floorboards creaked as his weight transferred. Click, clack. The footsteps resumed moving past her door, continuing down the long corridor toward the opposite wing of the house. A moment later, she heard the distinct heavy thud of a door closing, a latch falling into place, a lock turning. The sound hit Amelia with the force of a physical blow. She didn't cry. There was no sudden burst of theatrical weeping. Instead, a cold numbness spread from the center of her chest, outward, freezing the blood in her veins. She slowly released her grip on the velvet quilt. She looked down at her hands. The knuckles were white, trembling faintly down the hall in his own separate bedchamber. Arthur Pendleton meticulously unfastened his cravat. His movements were jerky, betrayed by a tension he refused to acknowledge. He peeled off his tailored jacket, the smell of his own nervous sweat rising beneath the expensive lavender cologne he wore. He stared at the blank wall, separating his wing from hers. His jaw clenched until his teeth ached. He told himself it was for the best. Intimacy was messy. It required a vulnerability he found fundamentally repulsive. His father had warned him of it. How women with their tears and their needs could dismantle a man's focus. Arthur believed in order. He believed in control. A locked door was neat. It drew a boundary. He poured himself a glass of brandy, his hand completely steady again. He swallowed the amber liquid, welcoming the harsh burn in his throat. He had fulfilled the public expectation of a wedding. The private reality was his to command. He would visit her when the absolute necessity of an heir demanded it, and not a moment sooner. In the cavernous room down the hall, Amelia finally moved. She walked over to the wash basin. The water in the picture was already cold. She dipped a cloth into it and pressed it against her face, letting the freezing water shock her system. She looked in the mirror once more. The ember of hope was gone, snuffed out by the sound of a locking mechanism. She dried her face, the rough towing scratching her skin, and climbed into the center of the massive empty bed. It felt like a tomb. 14 months passed. 14 months of a routine so rigidly adhered to it felt less like a marriage and more like a military occupation. Breakfast was served precisely at 8:00 in the morning in the informal dining room, a space that still managed to seat 20. Amelia sat at one end, Arthur at the other. Between them stretched a vast expanse of polished mahogany, adorned only by a single unimaginative silver candelabra. "The weather has turned unseasonably damp," Amelia said one Tuesday. Her voice cut through the silence, startling a rook outside the window. Arthur did not look up from the Financial Gazette he had propped against his teacup. He neatly sliced a piece of roasted kidney, lifted it to his mouth, and chewed precisely 5 times before swallowing. "Indeed," he murmured, his tone devoid of any inflection. Amelia stared at him. She watched the way the grey morning light caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone. She watched the methodical, almost robotic movements of his hands. "The draught in the east wing is growing worse." She tried again, pushing her uneaten scrambled eggs around her plate. The silver fork scraped against the bone china, a high grating sound that made her own teeth ache. "The wind comes right through the masonry in my bedchamber." Arthur finally lowered the paper. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met hers. There was no malice in them. That was the tragedy of it. If there had been malice, she could have fought it. There was only a profound echoing blankness. "I shall inform Mrs. Higgins to have the maids issue you an extra wool blanket," he said smoothly. He dabbed the corners of his mouth with a linen napkin. "And I will have the estate manager look at the mortar next spring. Is there anything else?" He had missed it entirely. The subtle plea for warmth, for an invitation to a different room, for any acknowledgement that a husband might offer a solution that involved his own presence. "No," Amelia said, the word tasting like ash. "A blanket will be fine." She stopped trying after that. The chipping away of her spirit was not a violent demolition, but a slow erosion. She began to shrink to fit the empty space he afforded her. She stopped wearing the heavy, expensive perfumes she had bought in London, realizing there was no one close enough to smell them. Instead, she smelled constantly of dried lavender from the sachets in her wardrobe and the bitter black tea she drank by the gallon to keep warm. She moved through Westford Manor like a ghost haunting her own life. She learned the exact floorboards that shrieked when stepped upon, and she avoided them, moving silently, so as not to disturb the oppressive quiet Arthur cultivated. Arthur, for his part, found their arrangement exceptionally agreeable. He considered himself a model husband. He paid her dressmaker's exorbitant bills without question. He never raised his voice. He never humiliated her with public mistreatment or brazen affairs. In his mind, he had granted her the ultimate luxury peace. He did not see the dark circles forming beneath her eyes. He did not notice that she had taken to biting the inside of her cheek so hard it bled, just to feel something sharp and real. One evening in late November, the isolation became a physical weight. The manor was locked in the grip of a brutal frost. The cold radiated off the stone walls, seeping into the marrow of Amelia's bones. She was in the library trying to read by the meagre light of a single lamp. The fire had died down to embers, and the footman had forgotten to restock the coal scuttle. She shivered violently, her teeth clicking together. She pulled her shawl tighter, but the damp cold seemed to bypass the wool entirely. She needed a book from the top shelf. She stood, her joints stiff, and reached up. Her foot slipped on the polished floor. She tumbled hard, her hip striking the edge of a mahogany-side table. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. The pain flared hot and sudden, followed by a sickening throb. She sat on the floor in the semi-darkness, clutching her side. She waited. The house was dead quiet. She knew Arthur was in his study just 2 doors down. She knew he possessed excellent hearing. She sat on the freezing floorboards for 10 minutes. No footsteps came. No door opened. No voice called out to ask if she was unharmed. She pulled herself up her leg, trembling the pain, a dull ache in her hip. She limped back to her chair and sat down. She didn't read. She just stared at the dying embers, watching them fade from angry red to lifeless grey. In his study, Arthur had heard the thud. He had paused his pen, hovering over a ledger. He waited for a cry, a call for assistance. When none came, he reasoned it was merely a shifted log in the fireplace, or a servant dropping a heavy bucket downstairs. He dipped his pen back into the inkwell, the rhythmic scratching sound filling his room once more. He preferred the predictability of numbers. Numbers never bruised. Numbers never asked him to heal them. The winter deepened, and with it came the illness. It started as a scratch in Amelia's throat, dry and irritating. By the 3rd day, it had bloomed into a raging fever. Her chest felt heavy, as if wrapped in iron bands, and every breath was a rattling struggle. She lay in her massive bed, soaked in a cold sweat. The extra wool blanket Arthur had ordered was heavy and suffocating, scratching against her fever-sensitive skin. The room was cast in deep shadows. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, monstrous shapes across the ceiling. In her delirium, the shadows seemed to mock her, twisting into the faces of the estate's servants who pied her of the husband who ignored her. Her mind fractured, slipping between lucid agony and feverish dreams. She felt terrifyingly small, a speck of dust, trapped in a massive freezing vault. She needed someone. It wasn't a romantic desire. It was a primal animalistic need for another living, breathing body. She needed to know she existed outside of her own head. Driven by a blind, desperate instinct, Amelia threw off the heavy blankets. The cold air of the room hit her sweat-drenched nightgown like a physical slap, making her gasp. Her legs wobbled violently as she stood, her bare feet shrinking away from the icy floorboards. She leaned heavily against the wall, using it to guide her toward the door. The stone sapped whatever heat was left in her hands. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy and numb, until the door swung open with a mournful creak. The corridor was a tunnel of darkness. She stumbled forward, her breath hitching in her chest, a harsh tearing sound in the silence. She didn't know where she was going at first. She just needed light. She needed heat. She saw the thin strip of golden light spilling from beneath Arthur's chamber door. She didn't think about propriety. She didn't think about his rigid rules. She reached the door and pushed it open. The contrast was staggering. Arthur's room was stiflingly warm. A massive fire roared in the hearth, casting a rich orange glow over the polished oak furniture and the thick Persian rug. The air smelled strongly of dry wood smoke and his lavender cologne. Arthur was seated in a leather armchair by the fire, a heavy volume resting on his lap. He wore a silk dressing gown, his hair neatly brushed, looking the picture of aristocratic comfort. He looked up as the door opened, his expression instantly shifting from relaxed to profoundly irritated. Amelia stood in the doorway, swaying. Her hair was matted with sweat. Her face flushed a sickly crimson, her eyes wide and glassy. She looked like a drowned corpse dragged from a river. Amelia. Arthur's voice was sharp, cutting through the warm air like a blade. He did not stand up. He did not step toward her. He recoiled, pressing himself deeper into the leather armchair. "What on earth are you doing out of your quarters?" Amelia took a step forward. The thick rug was soft against her frozen feet. Her voice was a cracked whisper. "I am freezing, Arthur. I am so cold." She took another step, reaching out a trembling hand toward the fire. Just the fire. She didn't even reach for him. "Stop right there," Arthur commanded. His voice held a note of genuine panic, now masked thinly by authority. He hated illness. It was messy. It was uncontrollable. It carried the stench of mortality, something he spent his life trying to outrun with ledgers and rules. "You are contagious. You will infect the entire wing." He stood abruptly, his book tumbling to the floor with a loud smack. He moved around the back of his armchair, putting a physical barrier between them. "Arthur, please." She rasped, her vision swimming, the edges of the room blurred. "Just let me sit by the hearth for a moment." "My room is a grave. You are being hysterical." He snapped, his jaw clenched tight. He looked at her, not with concern, but with a deep, visceral disgust. "You are unwell. The doctor will be summoned in the morning. For now, you must return to your bed. You are acting completely irrational." He reached for the bell pull on the wall beside him and yanked it violently. "Mrs. Higgins," he shouted toward the door. "Send up a maid immediately." Amelia stopped. Her outstretched hand fell limply to her side. The fever was still raging, but a sudden, terrifying clarity pierced through the haze in her brain. It was a cold, sharp blade of realization, slicing away the last festering remnants of her denial. She looked at her husband, really looked at him. She saw the way he gripped the back of the armchair, his knuckles white. She saw the fear in his pale eyes, the absolute revulsion at the sight of her vulnerability. He wasn't holding back out of stoicism. He was empty. There was nothing inside him capable of bridging the gap between them. He would watch her freeze to death on his expensive Persian rug before he risked dirtying his hands to help her up. A heavy, breathless silence descended upon the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Two maids, out of breath and wide-eyed, appeared in the doorway behind Amelia. "Your Grace." One of them squeaked, terrified. "Take the Duchess back to her room," Arthur ordered, not taking his eyes off Amelia. "She is delirious. See that she stays there." The maids approached hesitantly. One of them, Mary, gently touched Amelia's arm. The maid's hand was warm. It was the first human warmth Amelia had felt in over a year. Amelia didn't fight them. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. As Mary turned her around, Amelia looked back at Arthur one last time. He had already bent down to retrieve his fallen book from the floor. He was brushing a speck of dust off the leather cover. He was already erasing her intrusion from his mind. The snap inside Amelia's chest was almost audible. It wasn't a violent break. It was the quiet, dull thud of a heavy iron lock finally clicking shut. Not his lock, hers. The love she had tried to force, the duty she had tried to endure, it all evaporated, leaving a hollow, metallic taste in her mouth. She let the maids lead her back down the freezing, dark corridor. She didn't shiver anymore. The chill in her bones had finally reached her heart, and she found to her immense surprise that she preferred the cold. The fever broke on a Tuesday. It left Amelia hollowed out, her bones feeling as brittle as dried twigs, her skin papery and loose. The physician, a man who smelled perpetually of peppermints and pipe tobacco, declared her out of danger and left a bottle of dark, viscous tonic on the nightstand. Amelia poured it into the chamber pot the moment the door clicked shut. She did not ring for Mary to draw a bath. She did not ask for broth. She lay on her back, staring at the canopy of the massive bed, and listened to the house. She heard the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen, the muffled thump of a rug being beaten in the courtyard, the wind rattling the ill-fitting window panes. She felt nothing. The agonizing, suffocating weight that had pressed on her chest for 14 months was gone. Arthur's rejection in his study had not killed her. It had cauterized the wound. There was no more bleeding. There was no more hope. And without hope, there was only clarity. It took her 3 days to regain the strength to walk without leaning on the furniture. She used that time to calculate. She did not weep into her pillows. She did not draft a dramatic tear-stained letter of farewell. Notes were for people who wanted to be found, for women who wanted to inflict guilt. Amelia wanted neither. She wanted to vanish. On the fourth morning, she opened her heavy oak wardrobe. The smell of cedar and dried lavender wafted out. She bypassed the rows of silk gowns Arthur had paid for, the emerald velvets, the stiff taffetas, the corsets ribbed with whale bone. They were costumes for a play she was no longer acting in. Instead, she reached into the very back and pulled out a plain charcoal grey travelling dress she had brought with her from her father's house. The wool was thick and scratchy. It smelled faintly of camphor. She pulled it over her head, ignoring the complicated hooks and eyes in favor of the simple buttons down the front. She did not put on a corset. The sudden ability to draw a full deep breath into her lungs made her light-headed. She owned nothing in this house. The Pendleton name had bought her, but she had kept one thing hidden. Beneath the false bottom of her velvet jewelry box lay a small, heavy pouch. Inside were 20 gold sovereigns, money her mother had sewn into the lining of her winter coat years ago. A silent, desperate contingency fund from a woman who knew the brutal economics of marriage. Amelia slipped the pouch into a worn leather satchel. She added 2 pairs of thick woolen stockings, a clean linen shift, and a silver comb. Nothing else. She waited until 1:00 in the morning. The manor was a tomb wrapped in the profound heavy silence of the dead of night. She opened her bedchamber door. The hinges, which she had meticulously oiled with a dab of mutton fat stolen from her dinner tray the night before, made no sound. The corridor was pitch black. The air was freezing, biting at her cheeks and hands, but she didn't shiver. The cold felt different now. It wasn't an oppressive force pushing her down. It was a bracing, sharp reality. She moved with the practiced silence of a ghost. She knew which floorboards to avoid. She knew that the third stair from the bottom of the grand staircase groaned, so she stepped entirely over it, her calves straining with the effort. She reached the side door that led to the kitchen gardens. The heavy iron bolt was stiff. She wrapped her hands in her shawl and pulled with all her meager weight. It slid back with a dull metallic scrape that sounded like a gunshot to her ears. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Silence. The house did not wake. Amelia pushed the door open. The night air rushed in, smelling of wet earth, dying frost and pine needles. It tasted sharp and clean like iron. She stepped over the threshold. Her leather boots crunched softly on the gravel path. 2 miles down the lane at the crossroads, a mail coach would pass at exactly 2:00 in the morning, bound for the coast. A gold sovereign would secure a seat in the dark, unheated carriage among the cargo and sleeping drummers. She did not look back at Westford Manor, not once. She simply pulled her hood up, leaned her weight into the biting wind, and walked into the dark. At precisely 8:00 the following morning, Arthur Pendleton entered the informal dining room. He wore a perfectly tailored navy morning coat, his cravat tied with geometric precision. The room smelled of roasted meats and bitter orange marmalade. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table. The silver candelabra gleamed. He unfolded his crisp linen napkin, placed it across his lap, and picked up the Financial Gazette. 5 minutes passed. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked a heavy rhythmic pulse. Arthur did not look up from the column detailing shipping tariffs, but a subtle tension began to gather at the base of his neck. The peripheral emptiness at the other end of the table was pressing against his awareness. Amelia was never late. She was a fixture of the morning, silent and pale, pushing her food around her plate. Her presence was a minor irritant, but its absence was an anomaly. Arthur hated anomalies. At 8:15 he lowered the paper. The chair at the far end was pushed neatly in. The bone china plate was empty. He struck a small silver bell by his elbow. The sound was sharp and piercing. A footman appeared almost instantly. "Your Grace, the Duchess is absent." Arthur stated a statement of fact, not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. Her Grace has not rung for her breakfast tray." Arthur frowned. A faint irritation prickled his chest. Perhaps the fever had returned, or perhaps she was sulking. Yes, that was the likely explanation. Women sulked when denied their hysterics. She was likely waiting for him to send up inquiries to fuss over her. Have Mrs. Higgins send Mary to check on her. Arthur ordered, picking up his fork and neatly dissecting a piece of sausage. And tell the cook the eggs are overdone. Yes, Your Grace. Arthur chewed. He swallowed. He tried to return to the shipping tariffs, but the numbers seemed to blur slightly on the page. The silence in the dining room felt different today. It wasn't the heavy, suppressed silence of two people ignoring each other. It was a hollow, ringing silence. It sounded like a vacuum. By 900, the irritation had hardened into a tight knot behind his ribs. No one had come down to report on her condition. He threw his napkin onto the table, abandoning his half-eaten breakfast. He strode out of the dining room and ascended the grand staircase, his boots hitting the treads with excessive force. Click, clack, click, clack. He wanted her to hear him coming. He wanted her to know that her little display of temper was failing to disrupt his routine, though the rigid set of his jaw betrayed the opposite. He reached her corridor. He stopped outside her door. He raised his hand to knock, preparing his opening sentence. Amelia, this petulance is unbecoming of your station. His knuckles rapped against the heavy oak. 3 sharp authoritative raps, silence. Not even the rustle of bed sheets. Amelia, he said, his voice carrying easily through the wood. Nothing. The knot behind his ribs tightened, morphing into a cold, unfamiliar sensation. He grasped the brass handle. It turned smoothly. The door wasn't locked. Arthur pushed it open. The air in the room hit him first. It was stale. The faint metallic scent of the sick room had been overpowered by the dry, dead smell of cold ash from the hearth and the dusty sweetness of dried lavender. The fire had not been lit. The room was freezing. He stepped inside. Amelia. His voice bounced off the high plastered ceiling. The room was impeccably neat. Too neat. His eyes swept over the massive 4-poster bed. The heavy velvet quilt was pulled taut, smoothed perfectly over the mattress. The pillows were plumped. There was no indentation, no shape of a body beneath the covers. Arthur's breath hitched a tiny involuntary sound. He walked further into the room, his movements suddenly losing their measured precision. He went to the wardrobe and pulled the heavy doors open. The row of silk gowns hung there perfectly spaced, shimmering like dead fish scales in the weak morning light. He stared at them. His brain, so accustomed to processing logic and ledgers, struggled to categorize the visual data. Her clothes were here. Her silver-backed hairbrushes were still precisely aligned on the vanity, but a leather satchel that usually sat atop the armoire was gone. He turned slowly, surveying the space. He walked to the vanity. Next to the brushes sat a porcelain teacup. He looked down at it. A dark scummy ring had formed on the inside of the ceramic marking where the bitter black tea had sat and evaporated overnight. There was no letter. There was no tear-stained note propped against the mirror. There was only an absolute, terrifying erasure. Arthur touched the edge of the mattress. The velvet was cold and stiff. He realized his hand was shaking. He clenched it into a fist, staring down at his own white knuckles. The boundary he had so carefully maintained, the locked door he had insisted upon it, was still there. But the woman on the other side had simply ceased to exist within his walls. He had wanted distance. She had given him a void. Where is she? Arthur's voice was dangerously quiet. He stood in the center of his study, the heavy mahogany desk acting as a barricade between him and his staff. Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, stood rigidly before him, her hands clasped tightly over her starched apron. Beside her stood Mary, the young maid. Mary was staring fixedly at the intricate pattern of the Persian rug, her face pale, but her jaw set in a stubborn, unyielding line. "I cannot say, Your Grace." Mrs. Higgins replied, her tone perfectly, even maddeningly professional. "We found Her Grace's room empty when we went to strip the bed linen at 900. The side door to the kitchen gardens was unbolted." Arthur stared at her. His chest felt constricted as if an iron band were tightening around his lungs. The air in the study was suffocatingly hot, the fire roaring in the hearth. Yet a cold sweat was prickling along his hairline. She has been gone since the night, Arthur said, his voice vibrating with a sudden, barely contained rage. A duchess does not simply wander out into the freezing darkness without a carriage, without assistance. Someone saw something. Someone helped her. His gaze snapped to the young maid. You, Mary, you attended her daily. Mary flinched slightly but did not look up. I attended to her dressing and her tray. Your Grace, she spoke very little. Do not lie to me. Arthur slammed his open palm against the desk. The sharp crack echoed in the room, making both women jump. The inkwell rattled. He didn't want to shout. He hated men who lost control. But the foundation of his reality was cracking, and the sound of it was deafening. He leaned forward, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Did she pack a trunk? Did she arrange for a driver? No trunks are missing from the cellar. Your Grace, Mrs. Higgins said smoothly, stepping slightly in front of Mary, a subtle protective gesture that Arthur's panicked mind registered with a jolt of shock. The staff was protecting her. They knew. She took only the clothes on her back, it seems, Mrs. Higgins continued, and her heavy winter cloak. Arthur sank slowly back into his leather chair. The anger vanished as quickly as it had erupted, replaced by a dizzying wave of nausea. She took nothing. Not the jewels he had bought her, not the silk gowns, not the carriage, not the Pendleton name. She had stripped herself down to the barest essentials, discarding everything he had provided, everything that bound them legally and socially, as if it were infected flesh. Leave me, Arthur whispered, rubbing his temples. The women curtsied and backed out of the room, closing the heavy door with a soft final click. Arthur sat alone in the stifling heat. The silence in the house was no longer orderly. It was aggressive. It roared in his ears. He looked down at the open ledger on his desk. Columns of numbers, mortgages, crop yields, shipping taxes. They were meaningless shapes. The ink seemed to swim and bleed into the thick paper. He grabbed the heavy leather-bound book and hurled it violently across the room. It struck the stone fireplace, its spine cracking open like a broken neck, pages fluttering down into the ash. He stood up, his breathing shallow and rapid. He had to move. He had to find the logic in this. He left his study and began to walk the corridors. He walked the path she must have taken from her room to the stairs. He looked at the house, not as an owner, but as a prisoner trying to understand and escape. He stopped near the library. The memory flashed unbidden into his mind, a thud in the dark months ago, a cold November night. He had been sitting in his study. He had heard a heavy impact. He had ignored it. Arthur pushed open the library doors. The room was cold, the grate empty. He walked over to the tall bookshelves. Beside them was a heavy mahogany side table. He knelt down on the polished floorboards. He ran his hand along the sharp, unyielding edge of the table. He imagined the sickening crunch of bone against wood. He imagined the dark, the freezing air, the pain. He imagined her sitting on this very floor, waiting for a footstep that never came, waiting for a door to open. He pulled his hand back as if the wood had burned him. He had thought of himself as a disciplined man, a man who required boundaries to maintain order. He had viewed her emotional needs as a messy inconvenience, something to be managed with a locked door and a fat allowance. Now, kneeling in the dust of the empty library, the truth stripped him bare. It hadn't been discipline. It had been pure, unadulterated cowardice. He was terrified of the messiness of being loved. He was terrified of the responsibility of holding another human being's fragility in his hands. He had built a fortress of rules and separate rooms to keep himself safe, never realizing that he had locked her inside a freezing tomb. He stood up, his chest heaving the air, refusing to enter his lungs properly. He stumbled back out into the corridor. The house stretched out before him, vast, opulent, and utterly dead. He had refused to share her bedchamber. He had refused to share her pain, and in doing so, he had forced her to carve out her own survival far away from him. Arthur leaned heavily against the cold stone wall, pressing his forehead against the rough masonry. A low, ragged sound tore from his throat, a sound he had not made since he was a child. It was the sound of a man who has meticulously built a perfect impenetrable cage only to realize that he is the one trapped inside, and the only person holding the key has thrown it into the sea. He had to find her, not to bring her back. He knew with a devastating, crushing certainty that the woman who had walked out into the freezing night would never return to this house. He had to find her to see if the ghost he had created was still breathing. He pushed himself off the wall and began to run toward the stables. The frantic echo of his boots on the floorboards screaming into the silence. Click, clack, click, clack. Only this time, the sound was not measured. It was the desperate, chaotic rhythm of a man whose world was unraveling thread by thread. Arthur did not wait for his carriage to be harnessed. He did not pack a trunk. He went to the stables, shoving past a startled groom, and saddled his own geeling. His hands, usually so steady, fumbled wildly with the leather straps. He pulled the girth tight with a vicious jerk, the horse sighed, stepping in protest. He rode out of the Westford gates like a man pursued by devils. The freezing wind whipped his unfastened morning coat behind him, the expensive navy wool doing nothing to stop the biting chill. He didn't care. The physical discomfort was a relief. It was a sharp, biting reality that drowned out the echoing silence of his house. He reached the Crossroads toll house just after 10 in the morning. The mud was frozen solid in deep, treacherous ruts. Arthur threw himself off the horse before it had completely stopped his boots, hitting the frozen earth with a bone-jarring impact. He kicked open the door to the toll house. The air inside was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, spilled ale, and unwashed wool. A heavily jowled man sat by the fire, a ledger resting on his broad stomach. The night coach. Arthur demanded his breathing ragged. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't demand the respect of his title, the one that passes at 2 in the morning. Where does it terminate? The tollman scowled, looking Arthur up and down. He took in the wild eyes, the disheveled cravat, the mud splattered on the immaculate trousers. Terminates in Bristol, mate, stops at a dozen wretched towns before it smells the sea. Why? Arthur reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver crown, and slammed it onto the sticky wooden table. Did a woman board it alone? Dark hair, plain grey dress. The man eyed the silver, a greasy thumb rubbing his jaw. Maybe lot of folk move in the dark. Might have seen a lass hand over a gold sovereign. Odd that a sovereign for a seat in the freezing cargo hold. A sovereign. Her secret fund. The money he hadn't known about, hadn't controlled. Where did she get off? Arthur's voice was a low, desperate rasp. Driver mentioned a drop at Falmouth, the fishing port. The man slid the coin off the table and into his pocket. Rough place for a lady with gold. Arthur was back on his horse before the tollman finished his sentence. The journey took him 11 days. It was a systematic dismantling of his aristocratic shell. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke who required his tea at precisely a certain temperature and his ledgers perfectly ruled, found himself sleeping on lice-ridden straw pallets in roadside inns. He ate stale bread and tough salted mutton. He didn't shave. The elegant sharp lines of his face disappeared beneath a dark coarse scruff. The bespoke navy coat became stained with mud horse sweat and the greasy smoke of cheap tavern fires. He did not feel the degradation. He only felt the relentless gnawing terror that he was too late, that the cold or the road or the brutal men who populated the port towns had swallowed her whole. He arrived in Falmouth in a driving sleep. The town was a chaotic, wretched scar on the coastline, built entirely around the slaughter of fish and the launching of ships. The air tasted permanently of salt, rotting seaweed and wet ash. The streets were narrow, slick with fish guts and black mud. Arthur dismounted, leading his exhausted geling by the reins. He looked like any other desperate traveller, hollow-eyed, filthy, and shivering. He began at the docks. He walked into taverns where the floorboards were permanently sticky with tar and spilled rum. He asked the barmaids. He asked the sail-makers. He stood in the freezing sleep-choked market square, ignoring the fishmongers yelling over the screeching gulls, and scanned the faces of the women hurrying past with shawls pulled tight over their heads. She has nothing. His mind chanted a relentless loop of guilt. She has no family here. She has no recommendations. She is entirely alone. He slept in a room above a tavern that smelled of vomit and damp wood. For the first time in his life, he did not lock the door. He lay on the lumpy, damp mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the drunken brawls in the alleyway below. He wanted the noise. The noise meant there were living, breathing, flawed people around him. The noise kept the terrifying silence of Westford Manor out of his head. 3 days into his search, he lost his pocket watch. It was a heavy gold heirloom slipped from his waistcoat by a deft pickpocket in the market. Arthur realized it was gone hours later, and he felt a hysterical bubble of laughter rise in his chest. He, Arthur Pendleton, the man who regulated his life to the second, no longer knew what time it was, and it didn't matter. Time had stopped the moment he opened her empty bedroom door. On the 4th afternoon, the sleet stopped, replaced by a low, suffocating grey fog that rolled off the harbour. Arthur was walking down a narrow alley behind the shipwright's yards, his boots sinking into the muck. He was coughing, a deep rattling sound in his chest from the damp cold he had ignored for 2 weeks. He stopped to lean against a brick wall, letting a fit of coughing pass, pressing a dirty linen handkerchief to his mouth. When he lowered the cloth and opened his eyes, he saw her. She was 50 yards away, standing outside a narrow, dilapidated shop that smelled fiercely of rendered tallow and cheap soap. Arthur's heart slammed against his ribs with a force that made him dizzy. The breath left his lungs in a sharp rush. He pressed himself harder against the damp brickwork, his fingers digging into the mortar, terrified that if he blinked, she would dissolve back into the fog. She wore the same scratchy charcoal dress, but the hem was now stained with black mud and salt rime. She had a thick, coarse wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the kind sailors' wives wore. Her dark hair, which Mary used to pin up with pearl combs, was braided simply down her back, frizzy from the sea air. She was carrying a wooden crate. Arthur watched paralyzed as she shifted the crate onto her hip. It looked heavy, full of thick blocks of yellow soap. She didn't stumble. She didn't look fragile. The pale, ghost-like woman who used to push eggs around a bone china plate was gone. Her cheeks were flushed with cold and exertion. Her hands were bare, the skin red and chapped. She was negotiating with a hulking bearded man in a leather apron. Her voice, once a timid whisper, swallowed by the sheer size of the Westford dining room, carried down the alley. It was firm. It was sharp. 2 shillings for the lot, Mr. Higgins, and not a penny more, Amelia was saying, adjusting the crate on her hip. The lie balance is off on this batch. It'll strip the skin right off a sailor's hands, the large man grunted, running a dirty hand through his beard. You drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Vance. Mrs. Advance. She had stripped herself of his name. She had buried the Duchess. I drive a fair one, she replied simply. She handed the man the crate, held out her red, chapped hand, and waited as he dropped 2 silver coins into her palm. She turned and began walking down the alley directly toward where Arthur stood, frozen against the wall. He couldn't move. He felt like a man facing a firing squad. He had rehearsed 1,000 things to say. He had composed speeches of apology, frantic pleas, logical arguments. But as she drew closer, her boots crunching on the oyster shells embedded in the mud, every single word evaporated from his brain. She was 10 yards away. 5. She looked up. Their eyes met. Arthur stopped breathing. He braced himself for the reaction. He expected her to gasp. He expected her to drop the leather satchel she carried. He expected terror, or perhaps a sudden violent flare of hatred. He received neither. Amelia stopped walking. She looked at him. She took in his filthy matted hair, the dark stubble covering his jaw, the ruined navy coat, the mud crusted on his boots. Her expression did not change. The pale blue eyes that had once watched him with a desperate, starved hope were completely clear. They were terrifyingly empty. Not the blankness of submission, but the impenetrable calm of a fortress that had pulled up its drawbridge permanently. She looked at him the way one looks at a dead dog on the side of the road, with a fleeting clinical pity before stepping around it. Amelia. Arthur choked out. The name scraped his throat like swallowed glass. She did not flinch at the sound of his voice. She tightened her grip on her shawl. "You look awful, Arthur," she said. Her voice was flat, conversational. It held the same inflection she might use to comment on the unseasonably damp weather. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. He took a hesitant step forward, leaving the support of the wall. "I have been searching for you. Why?" The single syllable hit him harder than a physical blow. There was no anger in it, just genuine, baffling curiosity. "Why?" He repeated, his voice cracking. He felt a sudden frantic urge to grab her by the shoulders, to shake her, until she showed him a spark of the pain he was drowning in. "Because you are my wife. Because you left in the middle of the night. Because I thought you were dead in a ditch somewhere." "I was dead," she replied evenly. "I died 14 months ago. I just finally decided to stop haunting your house." She stepped to the side, preparing to walk past him. "Please." The word tore out of him, ragged and utterly devoid of pride. He stepped into her path, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Please, Amelia, do not walk away." She paused. She looked at his hands. They were filthy. The nails rimmed with black dirt. They were trembling violently. "I have a ledger to balance for the Chandler by Fortand," she said, glancing at the fog rolling in. "I am renting a room above the baker's on Cobble Street. Number 4. If you wish to speak, you may come there at 6, but do not stand in the street and block my way. I have work to do." She didn't wait for his answer. She stepped around him, her rough wool shawl brushing against his ruined coat, leaving the faint smell of rendered soap and sea salt in her wake. Arthur stood in the mud, watching her back disappear into the grey mist. He had found her. He had tracked her across the country, dragged himself through the dirt to stand before her. But as he watched her walk away with a steady, unhurried stride, he realized the terrifying truth. Finding her was nothing. She was a million miles further away from him now than she had ever been in the empty bedroom down the hall. The room above the baker's shop was scarcely larger than Arthur's dressing closet at Westford. The ceiling slanted precariously, the plaster yellowed and peeling. A single window strewn with salt and grime looked out over an alley filled with discarded fish barrels. The only heat came from a small iron stove in the corner, which radiated a weak, localized warmth. There was a narrow iron bed, a wash-stand with a chipped pitcher, and a small scarred pine table under the window. Amelia was sitting at the table when Arthur knocked. She didn't get to open the door. "It's unlatched." Arthur stepped inside. He had to duck his head to avoid the low door frame. The room smelled of yeast-burning coal and the sharp scent of the cheap lye soap she had been selling. It was utterly devoid of luxury. It was cramped, poor, and loud, the sounds of the baker shouting downstairs, vibrating through the floorboards. Yet, as Arthur looked at Amelia, bathed in the sickly yellow light of a single oil lamp, he realized this miserable little room felt more alive than any of the cavernous halls of his estate. "You didn't bring the constable," Amelia noted, setting down a steel nibbed pen. She had a ledger open in front of her, the columns filled with neat, precise handwriting. "I didn't come to arrest you," Arthur said, remaining standing near the door. He felt enormous in the tiny room, clumsy and out of place. He took off his ruined hat, holding it tightly in his hands. "Then why are you here?" she asked, turning her chair to face him. She didn't offer him a seat. There was only the one chair anyway. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, utterly composed. Arthur stared at her. He had spent his entire life building defenses. He had used money, titles, and rigid rules to keep the chaotic messiness of human emotion at bay. He had believed vulnerability was a weakness, a rot that would collapse the structure of his life. Standing in the freezing, yeast-scented room, he realized his structure had already collapsed. He had nothing left to defend. "Because I realized I was the one who locked the door," he said. His voice was quiet, lacking its usual commanding resonance. It sounded raw, scraped hollow by the cold and the dust of the road. Amelia's eyes narrowed slightly, a microscopic shift in her otherwise impassive face. She remained silent, forcing him to fill the void. I thought I was disciplined. Arthur continued, his fingers gripping the brim of his ruined hat, so tightly the felt began to tear. I thought I was sparing us both the indignity of a messy attachment. I thought if I provided the house, the clothes, the name, I had done my duty. I ignored you because to acknowledge you meant acknowledging that you required something I was terrified I didn't possess. And what was that? Amelia asked, her voice dangerously soft. A soul, Arthur whispered. The admission tasted like bile. It was the deepest, ugliest fear he harbored. My father was a cold man. He broke my mother with his indifference. I promised myself I would never be the tyrant he was, but I became something worse. I became a ghost. I built a perfect, quiet house, and I forced you to freeze to death inside it. He looked up, meeting her eyes. He didn't try to hide the tears that were finally tracking through the dirt on his face. They were hot and humiliating, and he let them fall. When I opened your door and found the room empty, his voice broke a pathetic, ragged sound. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. It was the loudest sound I have ever heard. I didn't come here to drag you back, Amelia. I came because I had to know if I had actually killed you. Amelia stared at him. The silence in the small room stretched tight, broken only by the hiss of the coal in the iron stove. She looked at the tears on his face. She remembered the night she had stood shivering in his stifling study, begging just to sit by his fire, and the look of sheer revulsion he had given her. She remembered the snap in her chest, the locking mechanism of her own heart shutting off. You didn't kill me, Arthur, she said finally, her tone devoid of the vindictive triumph he expected. It was just a statement of fact. But you killed the girl who married you. She is dead. I don't miss her. She was weak and she was foolish. And she thought love was something you could earn by being quiet. She stood up. She walked over to the washstand, poured a small amount of water from the chipped pitcher into a basin, and soaked a rag. She walked back to him and held it out. Wipe your face. You look like a beggar. Arthur looked at the damp rag. He slowly raised his hand and took it from her. Their fingers brushed. Hers were rough, coalesced from the soap crates and the freezing air. His were trembling. He pressed the cold cloth to his face, wiping away the mud and the salt and the tears. I will arrange for an allowance, Arthur said from behind the cloth. I will have my solicitors set up an account in your name in London. You won't have to carry crates of lye soap in the freezing fog. No. Arthur lowered the rag, staring at her in shock. Amelia, you are living in squalor. You cannot survive like this. I am surviving beautifully. She snapped, a sudden flash of true anger, finally breaking through her calm facade. This room is small and it is cold and it smells of dead fish. But it is mine. Every coal in that stove I bought, every piece of bread I earned. I am not a ledger entry here, Arthur. I am a person. I will not take your money. I will not be your dependent hiding away on an allowance so you can feel you have discharged your duty. It isn't about duty. Arthur yelled, the sudden volume making the window panes rattle. He threw the dirty rag onto the floor. It is about the fact that I cannot bear the thought of you suffering. I suffered for 14 months in a silk gown. She fired back, stepping into his space. Her chin raised, her eyes blazing. Do not dare lecture me on suffering. You don't know the meaning of the word. You don't know what it is to scream in an empty room and have nothing but the ticking of a clock answer you. Arthur flinched as if she had struck him. He looked down at her, seeing the fierce, unbreakable iron in her spine. He realized with a profound, aching clarity that he was entirely at her mercy. The Duke of Westford was gone. He was just a man standing in a dirty coat, begging a woman to let him exist in her world. He took a slow, deep breath, forcing the panic down. He looked around the cramped, miserable room. He looked at the hard iron bed, the scarred table, the chipped pitcher. All right, Arthur said softly. He walked past her toward the single chair at the table. He pulled it out. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the floorboards. He sat down. Amelia turned, watching him with weary confusion. What are you doing? I am not going back to Westford, Arthur said. He placed his hands flat on the pine table. They were still dirty. He didn't care. The estate manager can handle the planting. My solicitors can manage the investments. Arthur, get up. You cannot stay here. I am not staying in this room, he clarified, his voice remarkably steady. The frantic desperation had burned away, leaving a hard, solid resolve. I saw a boarding house 2 streets down. The sign said they have a room to let. It smells of boiled cabbage and wet dog. Amelia stared at him, her brow furrowed in disbelief. You are mad. You are a duke. You will last 2 days in this town before the damp gets into your lungs and kills you. Then I will die of the damp, Arthur said simply. He looked up at her, his pale eyes stripped of all pretense, all authority. I locked the door, Amelia, and I cannot undo that. I cannot force you to come back, and I will not try. But I am not going back to the silence. I'm going to rent a miserable room that smells of cabbage. I'm going to buy a thicker coat, and I'm going to stay in this town. She shook her head, a short disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. To what end? To torture yourself. To be near you, he said. The words didn't sound romantic. They sounded like a confession of absolute defeat. Not to possess you, not to command you, just to be in the same town where you are breathing. If you pass me in the market, you don't have to speak to me. If you carry crates of soap, I will not stop you, but I am going to be here. He watched the conflicting emotions war on her face. Skepticism, irritation, a lingering trace of the old deep hurt. But beneath it all, there was a spark of something else. Shock. He was entirely serious. The man who had refused to cross a hallway was willing to abandon an empire just to share the same miserable, foggy streets as her. You will hate it here, she warned him, her voice tight. The noise never stops. The people are crude, and I will not cook for you, Arthur. I will not mend your shirts. Arthur actually smiled. It was a small, broken, exhausted smile, but it changed the entire architecture of his face. I wouldn't dare ask you to, he said softly. He slowly stood up from the rickety chair. He picked up his ruined hat from the table. He didn't move toward her. He didn't reach out to touch her hand. He knew he had not earned the right to touch her, and perhaps he never would. He walked to the low door and opened it. The sounds of the baker shouting and a cart clattering over the cobblestones rushed up the stairs. It was loud, messy, and chaotic. Arthur turned back to look at Amelia one last time. She was standing by the stove, watching him with an unreadable expression. I will let you finish your ledger, Arthur said quietly. Good night, Mrs. Vance. He stepped out into the dark, narrow stairwell, closing the door softly behind him. It didn't click. There was no lock. He walked down into the freezing fish-scented street. The sleet was beginning to fall again, mixing with the fog. Arthur pulled his ruined collar up around his neck, shoved his cold, dirty hands into his pockets, and began walking down the cobblestones toward the boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage. He was freezing. He was exhausted. He had lost everything that defined him, and for the first time in his entire life, he felt like he was finally walking home. He traded a palace for a room that smelled of boiled cabbage, all to prove he could finally endure the messiness of love. Did Arthur's sacrifice redeem his past cowardice? Or is it too little too late? If this raw, imperfect ending made you feel the chill of the fog and the heat of his regret, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that true change requires tearing down our walls. Subscribe and comment below. Do you think Amelia ever let him hold her hand?